My name is Bill Clifford. I'm President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America, which is celebrating its 35th anniversary this year as a national association, although our oldest originates from just after World War I. Our keynote speaker today, Mariano Florentino Tino Cuellar, is the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's a former justice of the Supreme Court of California, the first Mexican immigrant to have such a position, and a former official in the Clinton and Obama administrations. He's a scholar and a leader academically, having been previously the Stanley Morrison Professor of Law at Stanford Law School and the director of the renowned Freeman Spogli Institute for International Affairs. He served as co-chair of the U.S. Department of Education's Equity and Excellence Commission, and he was elected to the president and fellows of Harvard College, the one of two governing boards at Harvard, in February 2019. Tino, as the new president this month of an institution that is in its 111th year, I think. You're the 10th president. Congratulations. Tell us first what you have in mind for Carnegie, and then we'll get to the topic, which is democracy, revitalizing democracy at home and abroad.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and for the opportunity to chat with all of you. I have actually benefited from the work of World Affairs Councils over the years, and particularly given that I'm a little distinctive in coming to this job, not as a former diplomat, but as a state official, I very much want to highlight and want to talk a little bit about the connection between the local and the global. So I have to say, and congratulations, by the way, on your 35th anniversary. That's terrific. I've been married almost 20 years, and that feels delightful and wonderful, but also it takes, commitment and determination. And I know 35 is a big number. So in 2013, when I was still working at the Freeman Spogli Institute, I think it was actually March of 2014, we had the Institute continues to have an office in Beijing at Peking University. And Michelle Obama visited as First Lady. We had a nice event that was meant to highlight the connections between civil society in China and the United States. And I remember we decided as part of that event, we were going to have a class session with people in Beijing and at Stanford with telepresence to connect both locations, and the First Lady participating in the discussion. And I was supposed to lead the discussion. And what I found was it was a good discussion, not because of anything I did particularly, but because people had interesting things to say. But there was something really strange psychologically about being in a setting where, despite the best technology at the time, I might make a joke in Beijing, and it would take like 0.7 seconds for the joke to travel to Palo Alto. But our minds are so wired to have immediate feedback that if I made the joke, looked over at the people on the screen, and heard and saw nothing but stone faces for even a few seconds, I realized that that was extremely difficult. So they wouldn't laugh. And then, of course, they'd eventually laugh. All that is to say, I'm not going to say anything funny right now, because I think it'll be a little bit difficult to manage with not getting the immediate feedback. So you asked about my plans. Your
sense of humor is coming through.
Good. You asked about my plans for the Carnegie Endowment. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but I want to just put it in global context if I could, and just spend maybe 6 or 7 minutes sketching out how I see the world right now, why our mission of promoting peace and international cooperation, global understanding around the tough issues the world faces is so important, but also so difficult. And we do it through knowledge, through analyses, through papers, through briefings, through information. We also do it through track 2 diplomacy. We do it through getting people to understand each other across borders. We do it through training the next generation. But why is it so difficult right now? Why are the opportunities so important? And to tell that story, I want to just go back to 1994 for a moment, which is the year I became an American citizen. And in 1994, I was a first-year law student, and what we now come to think of as the post-Cold War moment between the day that the Berlin Wall finally fell and 9/11, let's say, was brimming with possibility. The world was not completely peaceful. It's not that we didn't have horrific tragedies to deal with in the Balkans and Haiti, But there was an optimism, I would argue, about everything from what we now call the Washington Consensus, a sort of notion of how do countries develop and become better off, the trajectory of Russia and China, the possibility of real pluralism in some of these societies. States in the US, US states were experimenting with education reforms like Hope Scholarships in Georgia. We had a sort of substantial convergence on major issues in finance, economics, foreign policy between ascendant centrist Democrats and many Republicans. Obviously, the world looks very different right now. In California, where I grew up and have spent a lot of my career, the mid-1990s were actually complicated. They were a time of great polarization around criminal justice and immigration. Today in California, I would say there's been a convergence around multicultural democracy with substantial investments and fiscal responsibility. And that commands pretty widespread support among people in California. And that matters for the world because at Carnegie, we understand that a lot of the policy that actually gets made in the US and affects the world gets made at the state and local level. So, we have decisions to make at the state level about how to integrate immigrants, how to educate the public, how to invest in R&D, how to think about infrastructure, how do we police, how do we run elections. I often find it interesting to note that if you leave stimulus packages aside, if you leave defense spending and social welfare spending, about 80% of all governmental spending in America comes from the state and local level. So that means that if you want to think of the US as a computer system, which is not uncommon for us to think about in California, you would think about the hardware that runs a lot of the software really being at the state level. But our work at Carnegie in the years to come is going to be ideally not only to appeal to and brief government officials at the federal level and diplomats and government decision makers and civil society in national capitals around the world in places like Moscow and Brussels and New Delhi, but also connecting better with state officials, with people who are in your communities, metropolitan governments, to try to give them insight to complement your missions and get a better understanding to them about how the US fits into this time of great geopolitical change. Very briefly, just to wrap up, what do I see globally? I see an incredible set of possibilities, but enormous dangers as well. We're talking a situation where around the world, people face a climate emergency. They face big geopolitical changes in ascendant China, a US that has had more complicated relationships around the world, big changes in India as that country becomes more important and has a population there that, as with sub-Saharan Africa, folks who have been living in relative poverty now feel like they have a hope, an opportunity for life in the middle class. But how do we achieve that? How do we achieve that when we have to change fundamentally our energy infrastructure to deal with the climate emergency? And then, of course, we've got nuclear risk, which continues to be a problem. Thousands of nuclear weapons are deployed, and we have the risk of a new nuclear arms race as you think about what's happening in China. And then on top of that, you have a technological disruption that we're still recovering from around the internet and cybersecurity issues. So my goal is for the Carnegie Endowment to become more nimble in dealing with these challenges with honesty, candor, cooperation, and originality and creativity. We're going to start a Silicon Valley office to try to help us on that score. We're going to incubate new initiatives that someday will become independent. But I'll close finally by just noting, I believe in honesty, but I'm also an optimist. And I think it's important to put the US situation in context. We have lots of problems at home, but let's be honest. If you think about any country that is big, nobody has solved the challenge of governing in this era. Nobody's figured out how to do that with both incredible efficiency and real heart and humanity. If you're a large country with 60, 70, 100 million people or more, and you think about the technological disruption, the climate emergency, these rising expectations of prosperity. And so whether it's Japan, China, the European Union, or the US, we have a whole bunch of common problems. And I think at the root of what we do at Carnegie, there's an honesty about facing up to those problems and trying to do so in a way that will make the world a little closer. We can talk about Denmark. We can talk about places like that. I admire societies like Denmark, but let's remember, Denmark has half the population of LA County. California has 58 counties. So it's a very different challenge when we're talking about 5, 6, 7 million people. At scale, we have to find ways to live together and to do that in a way that is going to promote innovation, economic growth, and democracy and pluralism in a way that will help the world come together.
Thank you for opening with that. We've actually unpacked several of those issues at our 3-day conference this week. In fact, yesterday, one of our leaders, Peggy Pace from San Antonio, remarked that after going through panels on China and geopolitics, immigration, in the afternoon, we had a mayor from Afghanistan, Zarifa Ghaffari, who is a refugee living in Germany at the moment. We got to climate change, and she said, after all that depressing talk, who thought climate change would be the most optimistic subject we would encounter? Because there was sort of an innate optimism that came out of that discussion, partly for reasons you mentioned, innovation and so forth. But I want to get at that notion of maybe a loss of faith in democracy, or as you described in the 90s, it being so positive. American confidence seems to have taken a great hit in recent years, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan has accelerated that. There's a vulnerability when you think of the money spent, the drain on our military, the respect among allies and disrespect among adversaries. How do we redeem that? How do we recapture the confidence around our values?
You know, thank you for that. My grandfather had a saying, which was, you can't solve in 10 minutes a problem that's developed over the course of a year or two. And so we have to start by just understanding we're not going to get done with that redemption in 6 months or 7 months or 4 years. It's going to take, ideally, an indication that Americans understand that we benefit from a more engaged position around the world, and that to some extent, however important it is, and it is very important, to invest at home, to develop our infrastructure, to renew our educational system, that what we do to engage abroad, to defend our allies, to understand societies like Russia and China better, is actually going to pay off for Americans. It's going to make a difference in our lives here. And so it's a great opening process to have our diplomats say, the US is back. We're interested in COP26. We believe in the Paris Accord. We have new commitments we're going to make on how to deal with changes in our economy and in our energy infrastructure to promote a reasonable climate resolution. We understand that some of what we'll need to do is also financial. It's going to be facilitating flows of private capital, as well as some aid and support to make sure that as the Global South tries to meet those aspirations for a much larger number of people who want to join the middle class, they'll be able to do so despite changes in our mix of energy and making it more sustainable. But all that, I think, is going to be just the opening. The real work for those of us interested in our well-being here in America, but also how well we understand the world and work with it, is going to happen in your communities. It's going to happen in Cleveland, in Cincinnati, in Texas, in California, in Vermont, in Virginia, to help people better understand why it's not an either or. You know, it's actually very important to empathize a little bit with the way the world looks and how it feels beyond our borders. So I think that's going to take, I don't want to say a generation, but I think that's going to take years. And I'm optimistic about where we're going to end up, but I think it's going to take all our effort in a long time.
President Biden won't have that much time. We don't know, anyway, 8 years at the most, but in office, he, as candidate, put democracy at the center of his foreign policy strategy. And in September, after meeting with the Ukrainian President Zelensky, he said, Ukraine's success is central to the global struggle between democracy and autocracy, which is an interesting framing because as a global struggle, you see that geographically, Belarus, Hong Kong, Venezuela, Iran, Myanmar, Nicaragua are all internally repressing their societies, but also some of them are malign cross-border. How dangerous, first of all, is this competition that's being set up between democracy and autocracy? Do you see that?
Yeah, thank you. It's real. Let's start with that. There's no question that we talk about states being laboratories of democracy. Countries are laboratories of something, not democracy always, but how we govern. And unfortunately for the world, there's a lot of experience that we have. And this isn't just an American perspective. I think anyone who's honest about the difficulty of helping societies come together and improve their lot should admit that there is often a temptation for leaders to use brutal and even deeply personally coercive means to achieve the goal of harmony and peace internally, often at the expense of well-being for individuals and social progress, right? Because as Amartya Sen wrote very eloquently in a lot of his work, the kind of work that helped him win the Nobel Prize in Economics, we have to understand that voice and pluralism and responsiveness is not just like an intrinsic value, it also changes the way governments learn to be responsive to the needs of their people. All that said, there's a different way in which the reality is dangerous, and it goes in exactly opposite direction. That's why it's a tricky moment politically for the United States and for the world. We at the Carnegie Endowment are in the business of not being a purely American think tank. We are an institution with powerful American roots and some important American values, but we operate globally. We have many, many scholars who are based in places like Beirut and India and Moscow and Beijing. And the reality there is we have to understand that not every society or every country is going to come at these issues the same way. My hope is that over time, well-being for people, respect for what we like to call human rights, basic values here in the US will improve all over the world. But I think that it's just as important to recognize that if we just focus on what divides us without recognizing common problems we have around building shared prosperity, avoiding the climate calamity, getting a handle on some of these technologies we're developing that have great opportunities for human progress around education and medicine, but also bring risks of military impact and deployment and risks of social division as well, then it's going to be hard for us to deal with any of those problems. You know, I grew up on the US-Mexico border, and I constantly had the reminder that what was local was global too, that any number of problems that the US might want to solve with respect to water quality, air quality, health, were not going to be solved without cooperation with Mexico. And I will never expect Mexico and the US to agree on everything, to share values entirely. Everything from the architecture to the history to the nature of civic institutions can be really quite different in many ways. But there's got to be an ability to cooperate, even if we can critique other societies and understand that we don't share all values.
I want to pick up on your experience as an immigrant, and you went to schools in both countries, Mexico and the US, and went on to so many prestigious academic institutions, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford.
But my French teacher in Calexico High School,
am I missing one?
My French teacher in Calexico High School is the best teacher I've ever had.
No kidding. We have a lot of educators here who appreciate that. Before working in the White House, you directed a working group, and you were on a special assistant to the president for domestic policy, covering criminal justice and immigration and other issues. But before that, you were co-directing a working group on cross-border and immigration issues and refugees. And I wonder how you've seen the trajectory, what the Obama administration did not accomplish, what reversals the Trump administration injected to what Obama did accomplish, and where Biden's immigration policy is right now.
Okay, so this is a tough question that gives me reason for both real concern and some hope as well. I was able to get a really unparalleled opportunity with the Obama administration and the transition to work on some interesting and important issues. I felt very lucky, really humbled by the quality of the people who were my colleagues, impressed by both Republicans and Democrats I had a chance to work with on a lot of issues that ultimately led to some bipartisan change, including some new public health measures that balance the needs of the public with what would work well for business, some good reforms of criminal justice and sentencing reduction in some drug areas without being lacking any caution, the repeal of some laws that we colloquially refer to as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that limited who could serve our country in the military honorably and openly. All that stuff was bipartisan, and it actually strengthened my faith that there was room for thoughtful, powerful collaboration. Immigration breaks my heart, though. And I think often about what we might have done better, what we might have done differently. Contrary to a lot of public perceptions, there's a lot of focus on this in the Obama years. And certainly when I served in the early part, there were efforts to do a comprehensive deal that was bipartisan, that would generate a reform of our immigration laws that would address both the undocumented population as well as the real strategic imperative of keeping a flow of extraordinary people, ranging from talented scientists to just extraordinarily hardworking folks who were coming to join their families and wanted to do so legally. And the reforms were sketched out, they were vetted, they were discussed. There were elements that had to do with worker verification, the eligibility. There were elements that had to do with how to keep the flow of migrants coming, but in an orderly and fair fashion. And that also lived up to American traditions. But honestly, it was very, very difficult to work on that issue then. I go back to George W. Bush for a moment because I highlight that this issue has a strong bipartisan tradition. And that's a good thing, right? To my mind, it highlights that we could disagree about all kinds of things from tax policy to education to criminal justice and still find that it was Reagan who did the Immigration Reform Act in the mid-'80s that regularized the status of a lot of undocumented people. And George H.W. Bush that expanded visas to immigrants. And, Obama that tried his best to do that and, found ways to try to advance the ball a little bit using the DHS policies to try to keep families unified. But in the end, what I found is that spirit that was reflective in George W. Bush's efforts to reform immigration that really got disrupted because of 9/11 and all the trauma that followed, that has not lived on. And instead, the issue's been weaponized and it's been turned into a cudgel and into a source of great soreness and pain. And, I think still the majority of the American people want a system that is orderly and fair and even has elements of generosity. And most Americans get that has been a strength for our country. It's powerful. It keeps us on edge on technology. It helps expand citizen diplomacy. It helps bring ideas. It helps bring a texture to our country that reflects our connections to all over the world. It makes us stronger at home. But we're not going to get there if we turn it into a political cudgel and if we only just try to highlight what is painful and difficult about this. Now, I'll end by noting that we got to be honest. Immigration is one of these issues that you can think of as analogous to I'm running a business and I'm hiring employees and I need some good employees. I need them to come in. And sometimes they're going to come in speaking a different language, having different skill sets, knowing different ways of cooking a great meal. But we're going to figure out a common language and figure out a way to come together. Other times, immigration feels to people like, I'm adopting a kid. I'm actually bringing somebody into my family and I'm sharing that life with them. And I also don't think we'll get anywhere if we ignore the real emotion that is involved there. If we ignore, for example, the great value of leaning into the idea that immigrants to this country should learn English to the best of their ability, that they should learn that here we have a tradition of openness and pluralism that requires everybody to pitch in, that, hard work is part of the American tradition. And I think that potential is there to achieve that balance, but I think it'll take inspired leadership, and it'll take leadership that cross divisions of ideology, geography, will need to be crucial, and you all will play a critical role. I see how immigrants can bring real economic dynamism and partnership to small towns, even in the Midwest and in the Southeast of this country. And that gives me hope. It shouldn't all be something that we do in places like California or Texas.
Thank you for that. I'm going to invite my colleagues to produce some questions for you because I don't want to ask all of them. And I think we're going to have some delivered to me to relay from our online audience as well. But I want to maybe pick up on something you said about technology. Well, I understand one of your objectives is to open a Carnegie office in Silicon Valley. And can you talk about the role of technology in our democracy, both on the plus side and the negative side of the ledger, and how you view, as someone who's worked in cyber law as well, how you view the challenges before us, both in democracy in general, but also particularly now in electoral politics?
So we have a tendency often to think of technology as not being technology once it becomes familiar enough. So a car is a piece of technology. TV, when people watch it, which they mostly don't anymore, they stream, is a piece of technology. A book is a piece of technology. So once it becomes familiar enough and we have time and some degree of decency and honesty, we generally are able to adapt our values and our governance to that particular technology. There were arguments pretty strongly considered among people who passed as intellectuals at the time of the printing press being invented and disseminating and scaling up, as we say in Silicon Valley, that were basically a defense of limiting access to knowledge, making that really the province of a special class of people who had the wherewithal, the capacity to talk to God, like whatever it might be, that put them in that special space. Most of us are rightly alarmed by those kinds of arguments today. But it would be foolish, reckless, to ignore how the latest iteration of this wave of innovation brings not only possibilities for democratizing knowledge, but also among the most severe risks to the whole enterprise of public democracy and public debate and deliberation that we've ever known. The reasons are pretty familiar to most of this audience, but I'll highlight three in particular. Number one, this technology is about spreading information, but information is often false. Number two, this technology, even more so than cable news, allows people to congregate when they share interests. That's what we're doing here. We share interests, we're congregating. It's not always bad, but if it becomes an echo chamber, we can only understand the language and concept and ideas that people who would join a World Affairs Council believe in, and not the kinds of ideas that somebody might be really hard pressed to accept here, but that might be really commonplace to folks who have no time for what we do. Then we diminish our ability to have a collective conversation. Hard enough when you have hundreds of millions of people. One reason why we've depended on intermediaries is because at scale, when you're talking about a city or a state, it's very, very difficult to ultimately do that without people guiding the conversation a little bit. That said, we live now with a technology that narrows us as well as expands us. Third, this technology is pretty addictive. Like anybody who has a kid in the audience, and I do, you know that anyone who's trying to be a reasonably good parent or run a reasonably efficient organization has a lot to think about when it comes to how do you take the benefits from this technology without creating a kind of diminishment of people's ability to focus and deliberate and think carefully about an argument. Now, I'm aware that that's my perspective as somebody who's not 25, right? He's not 15 for sure. But I feel pretty strongly that if we are going to get this right, we need to be honest about the risks and limitations. That's going to take an honest conversation about our values and norms around this technology, around how we regulate while still honoring the First Amendment here in the US, how we develop ideas for working well with the private sector and with critics of the private sector, and Carnegie will do a good bit of that. And how do we learn from the experiences of other countries? Because we don't have a monopoly on good ideas. Fortunately, we don't have a monopoly on bad ideas either. So there's a lot of work to do in the days ahead.
Looking ahead to the Democracy Summit, the Summit for Democracy, I guess is its official name, that the Biden administration is hosting, convening 108 countries. What do you think, the priorities have been identified as anti-corruption, fighting anti-corruption, advancing respect for human rights and others. What do you think is going to be the outcome of this besides a second summit a year from now?
I think the outcome, yeah, no, good. I think it's going to be more than symbolic. To be honest, you know, President Biden is somebody who seems to care quite a bit about this. Jake Sullivan, who used to be at Carnegie and is now the National Security Advisor, cares a great deal about this. Tony Blinken cares a great deal about this. And there is a lot to be said for getting democracies to think about these very technology issues we've just been talking about. How do you have a free and open system of sharing information technologically and not make it so eminently hackable by other countries that, or even transnational criminal organizations or whomever, who have no particular interest in encouraging a successful democratic process in a lot of these countries. So I'd put that as one of the very important dimensions for collaboration and close innovation, sharing of ideas. That said, we all have had experiences where some group is being formed and we're not in it. And despite our best efforts to be totally zen about it, we don't feel great about that most of the time. Somebody says like, look, I've got a special group of people that's coming together. We have some things in common. You happen not to fit on that score. So what do we do about that? That should be on the agenda for not just the summit, but the next one. How do democracies come together, affirm our values, think about the problems we have together, why our system is special, why it offers something important to the world, compelling example, how we can make it better, how it needs to be adopted and adapted across cultures, but also how do we work with countries that don't have our perspective on pluralist democracy so that we can support, human rights and basic human dignity and work together on issues like climate and not simply be talking to a smaller and smaller and purer group of countries that happen to be able to put a gold star on each other's forehead.
One of the things the president as candidate expressed in a foreign affairs article in late 2020 was that he wrote saying he wanted this summit and that civil society organizations should be a part of it. But this summit is really only governments. And I feel that that's a miss, that by not elevating civil society actors now and not having that input, there won't be sort of the substance that we really need to get to grips with.
Yeah, I agree. I'll tell you, having journeyed from being a sitting public official to leading a civil society organization, I can relate and I understand what you're saying. I think one way it makes things a little less complicated, but still, I think you raise a good point, is that it's going to be difficult enough to get an agenda that works for 100 plus countries who frankly probably meet some implicit criterion of democracy that the administration is applying, but probably don't agree entirely on the definition of democracy, much less on what the agenda for this kind of meeting should be. And if you add civil society as an agenda setter, it gets more complicated. And if you add civil society, but not as an agenda setter, but a participant otherwise, then there's tension even there. Still, I think I'm with you. I think there probably would have been some good ways to integrate civil society in a manner that would have underscored the very point of democracy sometimes, which is to have open deliberation, not only inside government, but among a much larger group that works.
Here we have some questions from our audience finally, and I'm pleased to put these to you. One comes from Chris Hislop, who is the executive director of the Montana World Affairs Council. He asks, we put faith in the ability of liberal democratic values, in quote marks, to exert our will and further our interests in the world. But do the average Chinese, Russian, and others really care about and actually want to abide by these values?
It's hard to know. I think that the very nice thing about that question is it invites us to try to have some empathy. And I guess to me, it's possible to hold two positions together that are at some level a little bit in tension with each other, but another level, I think, are ultimately not. One position is a very American one, I'd like to say, which is reflective of why I came to this country, why I wanted to be an American, and that is, we're not perfect. We have many things we do wrong. We could talk a lot about that. I've seen it as a justice when it comes to access to justice, policing, like why some people have better legal representation than others, how effectively or not do we educate people in our public schools, how honest and successful are we at providing opportunity across all kinds of divides, rural, urban, rich, poor. And yet we believe in certain values like human dignity, due process, rule of law, equal protection, that we think transcend our own internal divisions, our own differences of religion and background. And we think they have some place in the world. We'd like to be dealing mostly with countries that respect those values to some degree. By the same token, for billions of people around the world, what matters a lot more is my family safe? Does my family have enough to eat? Do we have a home that's not going to flood? Are we going to lose that home? Is the roof going to cave in? Are we going to be hit by a terrible storm? They don't even get to the point where they can sort of think carefully about the healthcare access type questions that are very much frequent elements of our deliberation process that come back time and again. And for many people in that situation, then what's happening in China is seen through a lens of, is my family going to benefit? Can I have some progress and some opportunity to join a global middle class of some kind, it's of some definition? And if the answer is yes, and it's credible, then I'm willing to make a lot of other compromises. And in places like India, if there is a particular religious or cultural lens that attaches to the way democracy is approached, many people feel like that's okay, so long as most people benefit and become more prosperous. We have a right to critique a lot of what happens, and I think the world will be better for our critiques, but I don't think we should lose that sense of empathy. I think it's quite powerful.
Also powerful, I would say, is the worldwide reaction to the murder of George Floyd in standing up, and I think those universal values were reflected in that.
That's right. I think that's a terrific example. And it's probably been a subject of some discussion among all these wonderful World Affairs Councils represented here. Like, what a great, compelling example that even well away from my, house where I was growing up, 5 blocks away from the US-Mexico border, where the local is the global, you're sitting in Minneapolis and the local is the global. And I think people rightly saw in that a reminder that even a very powerful country that likes to talk a good game has its issues. And I think it will do us well to remember that the entire world cared about that.
Here's an anonymous question, somewhat related. Kyle Rittenhouse was just acquitted on all counts. Comment.
Huh. This is one where I miss the ability I had as a judge to say, like, I just don't comment on litigation because I'm judge and a sitting judge, no pending case I can comment on. And I guess, you could argue it's not a pending case anymore. I'm not a judge. I look, these things are hard, right? Like, at some point, I got to tell you, I can't sit here and defend every jury verdict in America or certainly in history. There's some ugly things that happen with jury verdicts, including historically, if I go back in history and time, a degree of, jury verdicts and legal proceedings and appellate court review of those legal proceedings that at a minimum, to be very diplomatic, could raise real questions about whether we valued all lives equally in this country. And, some of those challenges continue to this day. That said, I got to tell you that another thing I realized as a judge is that the vast majority of people who have opinions on jury verdicts, they're nowhere near the position of, say, a reviewing court or trial court judge or jurors who pay attention or are conscientious and actually hear all the evidence. So, what can I say? There's a good bit of that we have to struggle with. In the end, it feels to me like juries are messy, they're difficult, they're sui generis, like they introduce some real risk of inconsistency. They tax our lay people in ways that are often extraordinarily difficult for them. As you know, if you've sat on a jury, they're full of contingencies and a bit of randomness. But we have them because in our tradition, there's no better system to involve the public and make sure that this process is not totally just run by a special professional class that can go behind closed doors and make decisions on its own. So I see these things as a part of the continuing drama that we're going to have in making our system live up to our values.
An online question from Mohammed. what do you think are the minimum requirements for a democratic country or society?
So it's a good question, because just about any country in the world can, and just about every country in the world at times wants to and does try to define itself as a democracy. It's got to be more than the country calls itself a democracy. There are plenty of countries with the word democratic in their name that are not democracies. I view the most important elements as really being about safeguarding and openness in the political process. And so we can talk about electoral systems that are viewed as reliable and are reliable, where votes are actually counted. We can talk about the ability of people to express ideas such that they can inform, debate, and analyze and ultimately shape what the discourse and the words and ideas people are using to make decisions in those elections with integrity. So like free, fair, and open elections and no openness to the political discourse is a recipe for not a real democracy. We could talk about the role of civil society, which has come up in our discussion already, and how if you have only the government and the people, it never really works. So some possibility for forming associations, political parties, think tanks, civil society entities, defense councils of this and that, litigating organizations. I can talk about the need for legal recourse, where if any of these processes is not being honored effectively, or if you're being deprived of your property for political reasons or silenced for political reasons, you can go to court and have a process that will deal with you with integrity and decency and reliability for the most part, right? And then I guess we can talk about some degree, and here we get to the more debatable part where some people will get off the bus and say, no, I'm not going to support that. But I would say enough social equality that it does not become a real joke for some people to be able to participate. Like, and this goes back to the point I was making earlier, like for the people in the world who are so hard pressed to think about anything but just their immediate survival, if you have a large enough chunk of your population that falls in that category, anything about what I've said otherwise becomes a little too foreign, a little too abstract, a little too vague, a little too just not real to really matter. And then, at the core of this also, we're going to have some functional institutions that do not fail all the time at getting something done. So if you have everything I've just said, but every time there is some democratic input, you end up having nothing done because it gets mired in too much litigation or too much political debate or too much Senate process or too much whatever, then the whole system begins to break down. So, I think importantly, all this depends on values, right? It doesn't just reflect what you can legislate into a statute or regulatory rule, a constitutional provision. It's kind of like underlying it is, if I'm of a particular political or ideological background and I have some real power over these institutions, am I going to use it to the max just to benefit my own side? Or do I think there's a process that is going to benefit me when I'm not in as much power? And do I want to try to protect that a little bit?
I'd like to wrap up with, a question that goes to the heart of government service, which you've participated in, and relate that to the speech that got us here to our conference, which was Tony Blinken's A Foreign Policy for the American People. And he described the blurring of domestic and foreign policy personally, and in ways that over his career he had not seen before. So a commitment to connecting domestic and foreign policy seems to be there, but it's notoriously hard for democracies. And institutionally, you have silos. And having worked in the White House yourself, can you imagine a set of working groups or something that will sort of undergird what Biden says he wants to do, both in revitalizing democracy, but also connecting domestic and foreign policy?
I've been very interested in these very questions for my entire career. And I think some of it comes to growing up on the border and seeing that the local is the global, the local is the national, and it's the global. And if you look at where my career went for much of my life, it's law and justice, public health, immigration, technology, and transnational crime issues. And these all are issues that highlight that anybody who tries to tell a story where the foreign policy or international security decision makers can be sort of insulated from the domestic, they're just really like living in a fantasy world. I think it's taken some time for the more established voices and institutions in the world of foreign policy to catch up. But none of what I'm saying is a surprise to any of you, because you live it. Like, you understand why a high school teacher who's teaching history is actually shaping the values that are going to make for America's future diplomats. And it's soft power in the world. You get how some infrastructure project mired in debate, litigation, and paralyzed because of all these local divisions that's been stalled for 23 years is part of what weakens our infrastructure and our ability to tell a compelling story about our democracy around the world. I have to say that the imperative of building the right institutional structures, getting Treasury and the State Department to work more effectively together, having a working group at the White House that transcends these divisions, which is part of what we started in the Obama administration around global health and public health in the US, for example. That is important, but it pales in importance to the real challenge, which is, as our leaders have become more polarized, partly driven by technology, partly driven by our institutions, partly driven by the public has grown more polarized and more at odds with itself. And that division, much more than the division between sort of domestic and international, is the greatest peril to America, to be honest. I don't think any of us can expect that we're going to agree on just how much we should be taxed or exactly how to make religious freedom a reality, but not to have effectively the state subsidized religion. But if we can't come together and do a little bit of compromising around some very basic core things, around an economy that promotes opportunity and around fair and free and integrity laden process for democracy that doesn't get sort of recklessly, really brazenly and recklessly critiqued for no particularly good reason. If we don't come together around, like, our courts matter shouldn't be the subject of crass political attacks by presidential candidates arguing that somebody who's of Mexican origin can't be a judge with integrity. Never mind that he was born in Indiana, but whatever. Then I think we're really in a bad way. I feel an urgency about this because I have a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old. Many of you have kids. We all were kids at one point. We need to pass along a country that's in better shape than it is now. And I think we can do it, but it's going to take a lot of work.
I like the optimism that's in every answer you've shared with us. Tino.
Thank you.
I want to say that you are leading an institution, an august institution of tremendous scholars and thought leaders. And we are conveners of those people for the American people in civil discourse. And there is this connection. One of our council heads, Roz Engel, who leads the World Affairs Council of New Jersey, has worked at Carnegie after being at Treasury for many years, and made this in part possible by connecting me to you and your people. I hope we can work together and bring your research and your experts around the country to our communities.
Thank you to Roz. This was really a delight, and I'm so grateful that you all do the work that you do. Let's partner very deeply. We have a lot of work to do, but we can get it done.
I appreciate that, and we look forward to having you in person in Washington, D.C. too.
Wouldn't that be fun?
I know you're renovating a building. So anyway, thank you, Tino Cuellar, for joining us for our closing keynote luncheon.